Good evening and welcome to a Friday night edition of Tysky Sour. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very good, Michael. How are you thinking about, Tysky now on Friday nights? Me and you, we've done so well, but now the good weather's here, I'm worried all our wonderful followers are going to leave us.
Well, I'm worried about myself. There's never been a moment where I've been like, I'd love to be doing something else this evening, but now the sun's coming out, the days are getting longer. Obviously, I'm not going to go anywhere. I can do that on the other days of the week, and I hope you guys do the same. However hot it is, this is the place to be on a Friday night. You can always go out afterwards. And tonight's show is particularly unmissable. We are talking about the fallout from Dominic Cummings' testimony to a Commons Select Committee, especially as it refers to Matt Hancock. He is currently, well, I say he's fighting for his job. In fact, actually quite a lot of Tory MPs and the Prime Minister are rallying around him. So he probably will keep it. But we can look at the row that has generated and to what extent the issues it raises could damage the government. And we'll be talking about the Batley and Spen by-election. During Wednesday's Select Committee, Dominic Cummings' extraordinary attack on Matt Hancock had many prongs, but the one that appears to have stung the most is this.
We were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to care homes. We only subsequently found out that that hadn't happened. Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
So the core bit of Dominic Cummings' testimony was the idea that Matt Hancock had lied. So Matt Hancock had told the Prime Minister, had told Dominic Cummings that the care homes would be protected, people would be tested on being discharged from hospitals, and that didn't happen. Now, that's the new information. That's why I think this story has run so far when it comes to the newspapers and the media, because there is a claim and a counterclaim. Because we already knew that the government had failed to protect care homes. Much of this information was already on the public record. We knew that on the 17th of March, NHS trusts were told to expand their space for critical care by discharging patients into care homes. We also knew they were told tests were not necessary. And we knew that that advice did not change until a month later on the 16th of April. So you had a whole month in the middle of the biggest surge in the COVID crisis, and people were being discharged from hospitals into care homes without being tested. 25,000 patients were discharged. That's what we knew. What Cummings added, as I've said, is he said this was essentially not because of a failure of government in general. It was because of a failure of Matt Hancock, the health secretary, to be honest. So he said, Matt Hancock assured me and Boris Johnson that this would happen. It didn't. He's a liar. And I'm putting my words in his mouth, but essentially he's got blood on his hands for those lies. Let's see how Matt Hancock responded. He did a Downing Street press briefing yesterday, and as you would expect, he pushed back against Cummings' claims.
My recollection of events is that I committed to delivering that testing for people going from hospital into care homes when we could do it. I then went away and built the testing capacity for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of uses, including this one, and then delivered on the commitment that I made. And that is that's kind of normal way of how you get things done in government. You work out what needs to happen, you commit to making it happen, you go away and deliver on that commitment, and then you can put the policy in place.
Aaron, I want your opinion on this. We have two very disreputable people making a claim and a counterclaim. Dominic Cummings is saying the reason care homes were left in such a disastrously unprotected space, or left to be a disastrously unprotected space, was because Hancock said he would do something and then did not. Hancock says, no, I said that testing would happen, but I said that testing would happen when the capacity was there. And obviously, until mid-April, that capacity wasn't there. Who's lying? One of them has to be.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. Firstly, it's clearly a systems failure if the Prime Minister and his chief advisor can both be sick and a policy of this magnitude can go wrong. You know, that's not just about, oh, the Secretary of State for Health is a bad person, they're incompetent, they're a liar. It shouldn't hinge on the content of Matt Hancock's character or his capacity to follow through, because many people died as a result of this. So I think there's a broader question there about, is that even possible? I mean, you're on top of these issues far more than I am, Michael. So in terms of the civil service stepping in and so on, I find that quite hard to believe. We've not mentioned it here, but Dominic Cummings made an adjacent point, which was that Matt Hancock also basically tried to build infrastructure which met his short-term targets rather than thinking in the longer term about how we can actually respond to this more wholeheartedly. It was fundamentally a PR exercise for the Secretary of State for Health rather than solving the problem. I believe that. I absolutely believe that. And I think that's like I say, an adjacent question, and it has to be answered. But in terms of Matt Hancock is responsible for these deaths, I can't accept that that's the answer, because it's such a catastrophic failure of government. It has to be more than just one person. Surely there are safeguards. Surely there are firewalls. Surely there are people that feed back in real time and say, actually, we should be doing this. I mean, I was listening to BBC Radio 4 on Wednesday. This is just one story, Michael, but there are obviously thousands of stories like this. Somebody gets COVID-19 in a care home. They go into hospital. They're isolated, and then they're sent back to that care home. There were, I believe, 15 cases of COVID as a result of that single person. They were told they didn't need to be tested because they weren't kept in overnight. Again, just making it up as people go along. That person goes back into a care home. As a result, 10 people died. And you just think, wow. So if that's just a microcosm of a broader national problem, come on. You can't put this all on one person. As much as Matt Hancock is probably lying, as much as he should face fury and fire and real accountability over this, I think, come on, far broader questions of politics have to be asked here.
This idea to send people back into care homes without being tested. I mean, I'm not convinced that wasn't part of the plan, which was signed off by lots of people. Because if you remember in that testimony on Wednesday, one of the things that Dominic Cummings showed was a whiteboard, which was when they'd sort of put their new plan B into place, it just with a little black marker. And one of the boxes was, who don't we save? And I'm not saying this, I don't think they wanted to intentionally cull people. Obviously, I'm not saying they wanted people to die, but I do think that in those early days of the plan, because they were so out of their depth, they had got into a frame of mind whereby they wanted the hospitals free for younger people by any means necessary. So their big worry was that you'd have people who weren't close to the end of their life, who didn't get the care they needed because the hospitals were overwhelmed. So they said, well, to make sure that these people of younger age don't die, we kind of have to sacrifice the care homes. I think that probably was one of the logics, and no one wants to admit it now. Because also, I completely agree with what you're saying there, Aaron. This isn't the case of policy isn't just set by Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock in a room. And Matt Hancock told Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings it would happen. And he lied. And that's how this whole shit show happened. No, I think you would have had the involvement of many different people in the civil service. I mean, on stage, potentially even as well, because you have to remember, we were in a period of time when the scientists, in early March, we're saying the best case scenario is 260,000 people die. So I do think it is a bit silly to put this all on Matt Hancock. Having said that, I also agree with you. He strikes me as someone who has a proclivity to lie. I mean, the whole thing of Matt Hancock is he seems like a bit of a chancer, right? Someone who is very willing to bluff. We all saw him do it to us when it came to putting a protective ring around care homes, or especially when it came to the testing targets. That's what you were referring to before, Aaron, where Dominic Cummings is saying he set up this infrastructure which was just to make himself look good. I've got this 100,000 test target. We knew that target was only met by counting tests once you'd put them out in the post, right? Many of those tests were never done. They were never used. They were never returned, but they were counted within that target. What you'll often hear in Matt Hancock's interventions over the past couple of days is he says, look, actually, that target is why we managed to ramp up the test so quickly. We set an ambitious target and we met it. Maybe I fiddled the numbers, but the testing capacity still rose. I'll leave that for you to decide whether that's a reasonable argument. On the lying front, probably more convincing than anything Dominic Cummings could say is some documentary evidence he might be able to show. And Robert Peston had a very interesting report last night on this front. So I'm going to go to a quote from that. Peston writes, the problem for Hancock is, I understand, that Dominic Cummings has documents showing Matt Hancock was summoned by the Prime Minister's office to 10 Downing Street on the 3rd of May for a meeting on the 4th of May to explain whether he had misled Cummings, the PM, and the then Cabinet Secretary Mark Sedwell on testing patients before discharge into care homes, and also about further testing of residents and staff in care homes. A source says there was a fear in Downing Street that Mr. Hancock's negligence had killed people in care homes, a charge which the Department of Health has denied. The term negligence is used in the documents. Downing Street officials asked for information from the Department of Health to understand what had gone wrong. Now, to me, this does seem like this could potentially be more problematic for Matt Hancock. Again, will people just essentially, forgive him because it was a difficult period? Everything was up in the air. Or is there something in this documentary evidence which suggests that he was actively dishonest and that those active lies cost lives? I don't know what you think about what Peston has, I suppose revealed is too strong a word, but what Peston has intimated towards. You're saying there is some evidence here that at the time, this isn't just Dominic Cummings refashioning a story in hindsight because he wants to make history look a particular way that vindicates himself. This was, at the time, Matt Hancock was invited to a meeting because of negligence on his behalf.
Well, yeah, I presume the emphasis on negligence there, repeated by Peston, is talking about the legality of the whole thing. Look, Michael, my worry is that you get somebody who's set up as a fall guy, and that's kind of what Matt Hancock looks like right now. And that's not to say he didn't do things that he shouldn't have done, and that, like I say, he already should have been fired. Labour should already be asking for his resignation, which they're not doing. But I just feel like at the highest levels of government, there should be more fail-safes than this. There are elite civil servants. It may be that this extends. We've already seen, for instance, Mark Sedwell implicated in this. It may be actually that much of the senior civil service seemed to kind of go along with the whole herd immunity sort of hypothesis for far longer than we thought. I mean, we knew they'd bought into it, but maybe that actually extended for a few days or a few weeks longer than we thought. Or maybe there was a kind of grey zone where there wasn't really a plan. So I'm kind of how can I put this? I'm cautious about sort of saying this is on Matt Hancock entirely and nobody else, because it does feel like there could be a set of interests: Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove, the civil service, higher parts of the Tory party, the media, putting this on one person. And I think that is A, not what happened, and B, clearly that's meant to serve a distinct set of political interests. That can't be allowed to happen.
No, I completely agree with that. And especially in that first phase, I mean, we've been saying it for months on this show, and also it's not a controversial point, that in March, in that first wave, what we had was a collective failure of the state, right? So yeah, Matt Hancock probably made some personal mistakes, potentially told some very damaging lies, but there was a big collective failure that a lot of people bear responsibility for. When it comes to the second wave, that's when one person is responsible, and that one person is Boris Johnson. We're going to move on to that in one moment. First of all, though, I do want to stick to this on this care issue just for one more clip. I think the fact that we are talking about the situation that care went through matters, and it is important that we are reminded that the fact that the protective shield, which we were told was being put around care homes, wasn't. Last night on Question Time, the chair of the National Care Association, Nadra Ahmed, said it was absolute rubbish that a protective shield had been put around care homes.
We put social care on the altar to be slaughtered whilst we worked on the mantra that the NHS must be protected. And I absolutely understand why we needed the NHS to be running in the way that it was, because we didn't know what was coming around the corner. I think what we didn't know was the consequence of ignoring social care.
Do you agree then with Matt Hancock's comment, again, this is another thing that's attracted some controversy, that he threw a protective shield around care homes?
Absolutely not. It's absolute rubbish. There was no shield around. I think that was an utterance that came about in a form of embarrassment, perhaps, because nothing had been done for social care.
I mean, I think that is incredibly important information. There's absolute consensus on the part of people who work in care and people who run care bodies that they were abandoned in those early months. And I do think the attempt to rewrite history from people like Matt Hancock is offensive, essentially. And both myself and Aaron have suggested it would be wrong to just make Matt Hancock the fall guy for everything. That's all the catastrophes that have happened over the past 15 months. I also think it would be wrong if we had too strong a focus on that first wave, precisely because in that first wave there was a real collective failure. Many of the mistakes were, different mistakes were to different degrees, but lots of them were understandable in the extent to which this was an unforeseen circumstance. Some of the science was wrong. There were a real collective failure, collective panic, which meant that some things were inevitably going to go wrong. I'm not convinced that what happened was because of malice or gross negligence. I mean, in many cases it clearly was, but the overall picture wasn't necessarily that. Later on in the pandemic, it 100% was, because by the time we got to the second wave, we knew how COVID worked. The scientists had a very strong consensus, which is that we need to take tough early action. We can't pursue silly herd immunity policies. But what happened then was that one politician, one individual actively blocked the correct decisions and the correct policies taking place. That was, of course, Boris Johnson. And what I'm a bit disappointed about when it comes to the mainstream media on this is that we haven't seen those clips about Boris Johnson in the press as much as we've seen the clips about Matt Hancock. So I want to show you what I think is probably the most relevant part when it comes to this issue. This is Dominic Cummings describing how Johnson rejected the mainstream scientific advice in the early stages of the second wave.
By this point, unfortunately, the Prime Minister was listening to various people who were saying things like, there's already herd immunity in the population, there won't be any second wave, etc., etc. So we had this meeting in the Cabinet Room Sunday evening. Patrick and Chris gave their view. A guy called Hennigan and a woman from Oxford called Professor Gupta, I think it was, gave the kind of don't lock down view. John Edmonds said, who was on stage, surely we're going to learn the lessons of March. Here's what the data is going to be. You are not going to, the only logic of not doing a lockdown then will be that you're not going to do it at all. There's no way that you're going to make that decision. Just do it now, otherwise it's all going to be worse. The Prime Minister said, I'm not persuaded of that. It's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, therefore he must have taken it seriously. But in fact, after the first lockdown, his view was he was cross with me and for others into what he regarded as basically pushing him into the first lockdown. His argument after that happened was literally, quote, I should have been the mayor of Jaws and kept the beaches open. That's what he said on many, many occasions. So he didn't think in July or September, thank goodness we were pushed, thank goodness we did the first lockdown, it was obviously the right thing to do, etc., etc. His argument then was, we shouldn't have done the first lockdown, and I'm not going to make the same mistake again. He also essentially thought that he'd been gamed on the numbers in the first lockdown, and he thought the NHS would somehow have got through.
So, I mean, what you heard there was a description of someone who is a complete lockdown skeptic crank, someone whose blog would be in The Spectator, but who should be nowhere near policy making. I mean, obviously, Boris Johnson is more suited to having a blog in The Spectator than being Prime Minister. But what you had there was, it was like Julia Hartley-Brewer style. The numbers had been gamed. We maybe already have herd immunity. We should, he's often saying in other parts of the testimony, the cure is worse than that. We don't want the cure to be worse than the disease. It's all exactly the same as what Donald Trump was saying. And the practical consequences are exactly the same, which is both of them thought, meh, I feel better when the very marginal scientists tell me that this is just like flu. So I'm going to listen to them and I'm going to let them determine policy, even though, by this point, the whole of SAGE was saying, do not listen to Carl Hennigan and Sunetra Gupta. By the way, I do think that Cummings probably feigned forgetting their names because they're quite famous people at this point. If you've been paying attention to COVID-19, I'm sure he did that as a sort of low key par. But this idea that he thought the numbers had been gamed. I mean, that's like a Julia Hartley-Brewer tweet, but that was someone who was in number 10 and not only was influencing policy, but was, he was the person who was blocking the scientists making policy. That they're trying to say, let's take tough action. He's saying, no, I think the numbers are being fiddled. I don't think maybe we've got herd immunity already, right? And you couldn't just ignore him. You couldn't just send some angry quote tweets about him because he was the person making the decisions. And that's why, 100,000 people died since the summer, right? Is it the consequences could not be more severe. And I mean, that's, from my perspective, why making Matt Hancock the fall guy here would be particularly mistaken, and a focus on those first 3 months would be particularly mistaken, because the real criminal behavior was from Boris Johnson, and it was in that second wave when we knew everything we needed to know about COVID-19. Aaron, I want to go to you on this. And I mean, I suppose it is kind of phenomenal, isn't it, where policy is made by, in a way, a sort of conspiracy theorist, right? He thinks the numbers were fiddled and he was completely oblivious to the evidence, and he would only believe people who had blogs in The Spectator. Yeah.
I mean, you had Sage, I believe, Michael, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you had Sage basically, I think about September 20th, saying we need another lockdown now.
They were.
You had the opposition saying that. And again, it's curious. What was the civil service saying? The senior civil service, I mean. Mark Sedwill, etc. Again, we'll find that out in the inquiry, but it seems kind of strange because that is meant to be the handbrake on this idiocy. The Prime Minister, given our system, we don't have a presidential system, but the Prime Minister with a large electoral majority, if he's liked within his own party, like Thatcher in the 1980s, for instance, or Blair with the Iraq War, has extraordinary power, sort of de facto presidential powers, really. But one of the handbrakes on that is meant to be the civil service. So again, to be fair, kind of concerning.
That's not supposed to, their job is supposed to be to execute the wills and desires of the Prime Minister. So
they're meant to inform him.
If the Prime Minister doesn't want a lockdown, but everyone was informing him. That's the whole point. You had all of these advisors in the testimony from Dominic Cummings. They say, well, whose advice was he taking? He said he wasn't taking advice. So you had the chief medical officer, the chief scientific advisor. They're saying, and they're part of the civil service. They're the top jobs when it comes
specifically.
to that.
I mean specifically, number 10 strategy unit, the cabinet office, civil servants at the Ministry of Health, etc. I mean, people that, again, who knows? This will come out in the inquiry. People that, generally speaking, prime ministers, you're told to listen to these people. I mean, a great example recently is what we see with Lex Greensill and David Cameron. David Cameron brings somebody in basically because just purely on the say-so of a senior civil servant, so we're told, who's now passed away, so he can't defend himself. But that's meant to be the story. But like with so much in British politics, Michael, so much of this is about convention and the good chap theory of politics. And the second you don't have a good chap in the top job, kind of goes belly up. But again, I do feel like perhaps the civil service are a bit more implicated in this than we think. So basically what you're relaying here, Michael, and it could be correct, is that the entire state apparatus, the opposition, the advisors, the civil service, everybody gets this wrong at the beginning. Everybody. And I think that's clearly what happened. And that's clearly how the Tories are going to try and get out of it. But like you say, by the time of the second lockdown, everybody but the Prime Minister has changed direction. I wonder how clean that break really is.
Well, the Treasury hadn't. So, I mean, there were definitely some people who didn't want a lockdown. Rishi Sunak and the Treasury didn't because of the economic costs of it all. And I think Rishi Sunak was potentially also listening to these cranks as well. But the people whose responsibility it was to give Boris Johnson scientific advice were giving him the correct scientific advice. I mean, we also know that the Department of Health at this point was, and that's the other reason why it seems potentially unfair to make Matt Hancock the fall guy, because in that period of time, the Department of Health was the big driver for let's take early, serious action. And it was Rishi Sunak in the Treasury and Boris Johnson speaking to people at the Spectator and the Telegraph who blocked that action. So I do think, I take your point that I'm sure there are failings beyond Boris Johnson, but I do think in that second phase, it is the personality of Boris Johnson that meant that we didn't have that lockdown. I think it seems quite clear that the overwhelming wealth of advice was in favour of taking tough early action, but that Boris Johnson was incredibly resistant to that.
So you think on the big story of the second lockdown, which ultimately did kill, I think the most people.
It did,
we lost the majority of people since
people
January.
died after September. Yeah.
Yeah. So you pin that on Boris Johnson. I mean, that's, Michael Walker, that's why we need you at the number 10 Downing Street, press hustles. Because it's true, that's not the story right now. But I think, this has still got a long way to play out. And I think the worry of trying to effectively make Hancock the fall guy so early on is that come the inquiry, you've got nobody left. And of course, again, Cummings was saying this quite early on in his testimony. They were very happy for Hancock to stay in the room because they wanted the fall guy come the inquiry. But like you say, when it comes to the second lockdown, it's hard to see how Johnson gets out of this, unless some civil servants can be implicated, or like you say, the Treasury. Again, that presents problems to the Tories because then who's your successor? But Sunak is also up to his neck in this. We'll see if he gets the scrutiny from the media that deserves.
I mean, Cummings' line on what Sunak was quite interesting. So he was saying he was pushed on this because obviously everyone in the room knew that Sunak has been widely reported to be against a lockdown. Cummings' line there was he was saying, well, there's not a plan, so let's not have a lockdown without a plan. But that was precisely the argument that Cummings was saying was silly when the scientists were saying it originally, because we haven't modeled for a lockdown, we shouldn't do a lockdown. Later on, Sunak is saying because you haven't planned for a lockdown, let's not do a lockdown. He's up to his neck in this shit. Daniel Ovich Gofetsky with 499. People were predicting a pandemic since SARS and MERS as a global risk. Why are Labour parroting the unforeseen circumstance bollocks? It's an interesting point. I mean, I don't think it was necessarily an unforeseen circumstance, but it also wasn't the fault of necessarily. It wasn't a problem that we can put down purely to the politicians, because it is the case that at the start of the pandemic, I can't remember if it was the World Health Organization, but one big reputable body anyway had ranked Britain and America's pandemic preparedness plans as the best in the world. So there was clearly, in the West at least, obviously, Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, these guys are all much better at this. But when it comes to Western science, Western bureaucracy, Western governments, they were all equally, in a way, unprepared for this because they just hadn't, they hadn't learned from other places. Aaron, I know you want to comment on this because you've written quite a lot about the inability of governments, countries in the West to learn from SARS and MERS.
Yeah, I mean, pandemics and new pathogens, which come as a result of zoonotic spillover, this idea that a pathogen can go, or not idea, it happens, pathogen can spill over from one species to the next. That repeatedly happens. That's why we've got, avian flu, swine flu, why we've got Ebola, HIV, AIDS, all manner of things, multiple coronaviruses. But what I think people need to, again, try and be not fair to the government, because we don't need to be fair. But if you look at SARS, you look at MERS, and it's absolutely correct that the East Asian countries were better prepared for this because of their experience with SARS in the early 2000s. COVID-19 is markedly different in so much as many, many people are asymptomatic. And people just simply weren't prepared for a pathogen like this. So far more fatal than the flu, but at the same time, quite a few people don't exhibit any symptoms, which means it spreads like wildfire. Now, that's all, we all know this now. We've been talking about this stuff for more than a year. But that wasn't really being modelled by people. And, people were saying there could be another flu epidemic, which was, of course, the government's prevailing sort of operating principle at the start of this. And there were people like Mike Davis who was saying there will be multiple pandemics over the course of the 21st century because of climate change, deforestation, the fact we're just degrading nature to such a remarkable extent. But this was a real humdinger, right? Just by virtue of how it operates. It's not that lethal. But it's also pretty bad, and it's asymptomatic in lots of people. MERS, which is the second coronavirus, it primarily afflicts the Arabian Peninsula, I think that's only killed several hundred people. We've known about that for the best part of, I think, 15 years. Compare that to the experience of COVID-19. So, yes, I think governments should have been prepared for something like SARS, but even if they were, I still think we would have seen huge numbers of casualties. We should have had a SARS-like response, I think, by the summer. That's fair. But the initial hit and the initial response of the United States, other North American countries, Canada, the European Union, Britain, to some extent, I think it's not forgivable, but it's explicable.
I think that's a fair summary. If you're enjoying tonight's stream, remember to hit the like button. It's a great way of letting us know that you're enjoying the content, and it helps us in the algorithm. We are 3.5 weeks away from the date which was slated to be the end of all COVID restrictions. However, there are increasing concerns that the B.1.617.2 variant of coronavirus, which is more transmissible than the Kent strain, could knock that schedule off course. Now, there are a great set of graphics from the Financial Times explaining why the B.1.617.2, or the so-called Indian variant. That's what people say. Don't name them after the place of origin, but it's very hard to say these full names. They have a great graphic which is showing us essentially, why we should be a little bit worried about this variant, because it is spreading at quite a pace, and we can see it's massively out-competing the existing strains. So you can see here many of the places that are the current hotspots with the so-called Indian variant, and in the grey there, you can see the Kent strain is declining. Remember, the Kent strain was already a lot more transmissible than the original strain. And then in the red, you can see the new Indian variant strains, which are dramatically increasing. And in Bolton, you can see they've just completely rocketed. So cases were 50 for every 100,000 people. They've gone right up to 400 for every 100,000 people. So it's 0.5% of the population testing positive, essentially, and that's all, or nearly all, from that new strain. So we can see how much more transmissible it is, how big a problem this would cause. And remember when the Kent strain first started spreading, and cases were rocketing. They went up to 60,000 a day. And that was because we were like, oh, it's because we've got this new transmissible strain. This is even more transmissible. But, of course, there are some reasons to be cheerful, and that's because in this country, the vaccine rollout has gone very well. And while these new cases are rising at a fairly worrying pace, they aren't doing so among the oldest among us. So on the left here is the age range of people who are testing positive for COVID-19 in Bolton. You can see there's been a real spike among younger people. So people aged 5 to 24, almost 1% of people essentially have tested positive for this new strain. But when you get down to people who are 60 plus, very, very low, hasn't surged at all, has barely risen. Apologies. These are all COVID cases. So it's almost 1% of people between 5 and 24 are testing positive for COVID-19. But we do know the majority of that in Bolton is the Indian strain. So cases rocketing, but not really among the parts of the population most likely to die from COVID-19. Of course, that doesn't mean everything's okay, because it's not only old people that die from COVID-19, and dying from COVID-19 isn't the only bad thing that can happen. And hospital admissions have been rising for the first time in months. And they've risen by 20% across the UK in the last week, which is worrying. If you look at these graphs, you can see that from January onwards, daily admissions are steadily falling, and that has just reversed. Now, that will be partly because of this new strain, partly, I presume, and because of the relaxation of lockdown rules. Again, we think those admissions might not translate into deaths because they are generally younger people. And this is a very interesting graph showing us the breakdown of different age groups, or breakdown of inpatients depending on their age group in the autumn wave, and then in the current wave. You can see that the bulk of people in the autumn wave in hospital were between 65 and 84. Now, the majority of people in hospital are between 18 and 64. So essentially, we know they're less likely to die, but lots of young people going into hospital, not a good thing. The two big policy questions from this are, should we now pause the great unlocking on the 21st of June? Should we potentially keep some restrictions in place, or put that unlocking back a few weeks so that we've got more people vaccinating? That's a big policy question. There's also the question of, I suppose, personal behavior. And what I personally take away from this is, I think I haven't had COVID-19 yet, and I'm going to get vaccinated on the 8th of June. And all of this makes me think I'm probably not going to socialize indoors until then. Because whilst we're not going to have a scene like we had in January, we aren't going to see bodies piling up in the same way we did then, because so many of the vulnerable population are vaccinated. It does look like potentially over the next month, quite a lot of unvaccinated people are going to catch COVID-19. I'm currently still unvaccinated. I'd prefer for that not to happen. There also are, I do think we should be considering pausing the great unlocking, because given the pace of vaccinations, we will be in a much stronger position in quite a short period of time. I don't see why we wouldn't just wait that extra 3 weeks. Aaron, I want your thoughts on this briefly. Do you think we should go ahead with the big unlocking on the 21st of June, or do you think we should delay it a little bit?
I don't think it really matters that much. I mean, I think it's probably wise to delay it, see how things go. But I think, in a week's time, we're going to have a better idea of where we are right now. I think today we had 10 people have died within 28 days of a positive test. And I think we had 4,500 new cases, and the majority of which are this Indian variant. And people then, they see that and they reply and they say, oh, we're going to have another lockdown. Here we go again. And that's just a recency bias. And like you say, no, we're not going to see what happened in Christmas or over Christmas or last year because of the vaccination. And 4,500 cases, has to be seen in the context of opening things up again. There was clearly going to be an increase in the number of cases purely by virtue of the fact people aren't all stuck indoors. And we have opened up to an extraordinary extent, right? Schools, universities, people being encouraged to go back to work, now pubs, restaurants, and so on. So I think if you look at, for instance, schools and universities being shut over the summer, that's clearly going to help. I think the major concern is what's the state of play come, next October, November. And I think by then, it looks almost certain the entire population will have had 2 doses and will have boosters as well. That's the main thing. And so, 10 people have died. That's terrible. But, I don't mean to sound like somebody in The Spectator, but people die from the flu every day as well. And we're also going to have to get used now to the fact that this is here forever. COVID-19 and multiple variants are now here. They will sadly take people's lives as flu does, as a range of viruses and pathogens do already. And it's not wise necessarily to focus on, we've got 4,500 cases today, without also saying, well, how many cases of flu do we have active in the human population right now in the UK, right? That's the main thing. And so I think, yes, maybe push it back, be wise. And like you say, Michael, I think for people who haven't been vaccinated, very sensible to continue to take precautions. I think we all should, frankly, but I think particularly for people who've not been vaccinated. But I really would push back on these claims that, we need to have another lockdown. Here we go again. Because A, that's not going to happen, but also B, we now need to kind of understand the new reality of this thing being with us. COVID-19 is now part of cold and flu season, right? Probably for the rest of our lives. And that's obviously not a good thing, but we need to get used to it.
We do. I mean, I agree with everything you've said there. I suppose what I'd just add and emphasize is that we are in a fundamentally different situation now than we will be in 3 months' time or a year's time, because whilst, yes, we shouldn't close nightclubs because, forever, because there's some risk of COVID-19, it just so happens that right now we have a huge proportion of the population not vaccinated. In about a month or 2 months, we're going to have, almost all of the adult population basically immune from this virus. So it does seem to me as in, why not do the whole mass immunity thing before we do the unlocking? Considering there's about a month in it makes sense to me that you do them in the order where you say, let's all get vaccinated before we open everything, instead of saying, let's open everything, but don't worry, because we're all going to be vaccinated soon. It seems to me that it's about an order, not how should we live for the rest of our lives. But we won't dwell on this. This will definitely be a story which we are talking about over the coming weeks, because as Aaron says, we will be getting more information about this. If you are enjoying tonight's show, please do think about becoming a supporter at novaramedia.com/support. We're going to go back to that testimony now. Throughout the pandemic, we've often complained that the BBC's political editor is too interested in amplifying the claims of the Prime Minister and his advisors and not interested enough in holding the Prime Minister to account. Now, many saw confirmation of Laura Kunsberg's coziness with Downing Street in this claim made by Dominic Cummings.
I was working, say, roughly 100-hour weeks. Of that time, less than an hour a week for sure, less than 1%, much less than 1% was spent talking to the media. I did occasionally talk to people. The main person, really, though, that I spoke to in the whole of 2020 was Laura Kunsberg at the BBC, because the BBC has a special position in the country, obviously during a crisis.
That comment obviously set Twitter alight when Dominic Cummings name-checked Laura Kunsberg in his evidence to that Commons Select Committee. Do you think that puts her in a difficult position at all?
Hugely. Hugely. But before I say that, Michael, I just want to say, if he's working 100 hours a week, Dominic Cummings, that means he's working 6 days a week, 17 hours a day. And no wonder he was making such catastrophically bad decisions. And if that was the modus operandi for the people advising Boris Johnson, for the Prime Minister himself, which I don't believe it is, by the way, I don't believe Boris Johnson works 100 hours a week, and if that was the modus operandi for the cabinet, no wonder they made all these mistakes and errors, and they've had to subsequently lie and misrepresent what happened. God, you can't organise things. You can't run things properly if you're working like that. Yeah, you can do that for a week. You can't do that for months on end, because it's not just about your mental health or about looking after yourself. You're making really important decisions. You can't be sleep deprived like that. Going to Laura Kunsberg, which was your question, I think she has major problems, Michael, because, we and the great thing is with Twitter, this is all publicly documented. And if you look, for instance, when the Dominic Cummings story broke about him going to Barnard Castle, she was replying to people. She was literally the reply guy to people saying XYZ about Dominic Cummings. And she was saying, a source tells me, actually, that's not what happened. This happened instead. Now, if in rebutting other journalists' stories, using a single source, and that source was Dominic Cummings, she should absolutely be fired from the BBC as chief political editor. She should absolutely not have that job, Michael, because that is not journalism. She was rebutting a story about the Prime Minister's chief advisor using nothing but the testimony of said advisor. Come on. I mean, somebody who's doing just a journalism A-level knows that's not how you behave. And I seriously think 99% of BBC employees know that. They know that's not appropriate. So for the political editor to be doing that, I think that's a really serious problem. Now, we don't know that for sure. Maybe the source wasn't Dominic Cummings. But given he's saying that the only person I spoke to in the sort of media call was Laura Kunsberg, I think she should be asked questions about that. I think if there is an inquiry, it should also extend to the relationship between the media and Number 10 and the people around Number 10. That includes, of course, most probably Laura Kunsberg, but also Robert Peston. Because in questions of political communications in a moment of crisis, but also in terms of actually holding politicians and their advisors accountable, a clear failure has happened here. But I never thought it would be as bad as that, Michael. I never thought it would be as bad as that. And Dominic Cummings isn't daft. He knows he's implicated her there, and he's caused problems for her there. So I think he's probably cognizant of the fact there are going to be consequences. But like I say, if that is the case, she has to go. She has to go. She should resign. Of course, she won't resign. She should be fired, but of course, the BBC won't fire her. I personally think Laura Kunsberg is amongst the worst journalists at the BBC. So heaven knows how she's one of the most senior people there. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to me.
Let's get up those tweets you're talking about when it comes to her being the reply guy. So this famously involved the story which the Mirror broke. I think they broke it in conjunction with The Guardian, of Dominic Cummings breaking lockdown rules to go to Durham. So let's get up the tweet from Pippa Crowar from the Mirror. So she does the original tweet. Boris Johnson's top aide, Dominic Cummings, was investigated by police after breaking the government's own coronavirus lockdown rules. It was a huge story, completely broke the internet. Laura Kunsberg comes in to reply to Pippa Crowar saying, source says his trip was within guidelines as Cummings went to stay with his parents so they could help with childcare while he and his wife were ill. They insist no breach of lockdown. Now, I think regardless of what Dominic Cummings said, that was an incredibly misjudged tweet from Laura Kunsberg. I also do think she has a tendency to just parrot whatever a source tells her and not do any really real critical analysis. I mean, some of the documentaries you see, the Brexit documentaries where she's talking about Boris Johnson, he just wants to be loved. It's all, she's kind of in love with these characters she's reporting on, unless they're Jeremy Corbyn, of course. And I do think that makes her an exceptionally uncritical journalist. To focus, though, on, precisely what was said in that testimony? Because I'd push back at you slightly, Aaron, because I think probably what Dominic Cummings has said doesn't really implicate her, because it's never a secret that advisors speak to journalists. Rob Burley, who was head of political programming at the BBC until a few weeks ago, tweeted something to a similar effect when Twitter was popping off about this. So he tweeted, if Laura Kunsberg wasn't talking regularly to Cummings while he was in number 10, there'd be a problem. It's literally her job to talk to and assess the veracity of such sources to keep the public informed. And so I suppose what I'd put to you, Aaron, is, I mean, I think the problem with Kunsberg is that she doesn't assess the veracity of those sources. She often just repeats them. Source says this, source says that. And she doesn't, either give us the information we need to judge whether or not that source was biased or had a conflict of interest, etc. I don't think she does that. I don't think she's a particularly good journalist. But I don't think the fact that Dominic Cummings said, I speak to Laura Kunsberg, is bad for Laura Kunsberg, because that's supposed to happen.
So let me rephrase this. There is no issue with Dominic Cummings in abstract speaking to Laura Kunsberg. The issue is we now know he spoke to her, and we know what she wrote at the time. And that's the problem. So if we can just pull that tweet back up again, Michael, if we can just get that thing that
Rob Burley one, or
please, the Rob Burley tweet. Let's go over this. If BBC Laura Kay wasn't talking regularly to Cummings while he was number 10, there'd be a problem. I agree. It's literally her job to talk to and assess the veracity of such sources to keep the public informed. She was misinforming the public, Michael. There was a claim made by Pippa Crerar, well-evidenced, well-sourced, multiple sources, which was a serious bad news story for the government. And Laura Kunsberg is saying that's not true, right? That's not true on the basis of a single source.
That's not true, but...
Okay. She's questioning... Okay. No. Okay. She's questioning the veracity. We can look at her phrasing again, Michael, but it wasn't really... It was pretty certain. She's questioning the veracity of that story, well-sourced story, on the basis of one source, who's a person mentioned in that story, Michael. So no, I don't think she was in any way doing her job. I think Rob Burley's living in cloud cuckoo land. If that's what he thinks, if he thinks that's acceptable, particularly, by the way, if her source was Dominic Cummings, it's completely unacceptable. He doesn't know what he's talking about. No wonder the BBC's in the state it is if you've got Rob Burley saying that that's permissible. It's clearly not. It is clearly not. The BBC Style Guide for a very long time, I say this time after time, you were meant to have in a story two separate sources corroborating the story, unless it's Associated Press or Reuters. Except you're Laura Kunsberg, when it's your Twitter feed, then in that case it's okay if you just have Dominic Cummings saying something. Come on.
Let's get up that tweet again from Laura Kunsberg. Source says his trip was within guidelines as Cummings went to stay with his parents so they could help with childcare, blah, 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 blah. I mean, in her defense here, again, I think that was a stupid tweet. I don't think her reporting is very good, but you need two sources to say something's the case. You don't need two sources to say source says, because she's being explicit with what she's doing. I suppose you could say, if it's Cummings, she should say it's Cummings, because source says his trip. Who's the his there? Is the his the source?
They insist.
Cummings? Are they the same person?
But precisely. They insist no breach of lockdown. Come on, Michael. Come on. And Rob Burley...
I don't think it's a good tweet. I'm just saying...
No, technically I think you're right. You're absolutely right, because she's not saying it didn't happen. She's saying sources. But come on, Michael, if you're relying on if it was somebody other than Dominic Cummings and she wrote that, I would agree with you. But the question is, she's talking about this third person who's bringing into question the veracity of this account of multiple people, which we now know happened, right? People can talk about, multiple people saw the guy. I think the consensus was, even though he was kind of let off the hook, that he didn't go up there for the reasons he said, and he did lots of things wrong, such as travelling across the country when he thought he was sick, getting out of the car multiple times when he thought he may have coronavirus. Anyway, I think, Michael, it does hinge onto, if you have a BBC political editor rebutting a story about the chief political advisor for the Prime Minister, she says source says, one source, and the source is the person who's the story, she has to resign. She has to resign. Come on. Because that is so bad. That is so bad. What else is happening here, Michael? We saw it with the election coverage when there was apparently a Labour activist assaulted Matt Hancock's advisor. We knew that was rubbish. We only knew that was rubbish because there was a video, right? How many of these stories are there, Michael? And again, it doesn't matter if you're the Daily Mirror political editor or if you present Newsnight. Okay, she is the BBC's most senior political editor. It's a huge job, and she falls so far short so frequently. I can't understand how anybody could defend her. Rob Burley, I mean, he was working for the BBC. He's paid to defend her, sure. But any reasonable person looking at this, who's grasping the facts, being honest, come on. And by the way, she's had that job since 2010. And I can be quite honest here. BBC politics coverage since 2010 has been increasingly dire. You know, Kunsbergification. You just look at the whole thing, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Johnson, whether it's austerity. Were people really in receipt of the facts? Were they being informed? No. Like you say, she just sees it as some kind of personality play, some drama between ultimately some quite boring, wet, affluent, privileged people. That's not what politics journalism is meant to be about, Michael.
I mean, we agree on all of that. I mean, as I've talked about on many shows before, I suppose what I'm pushing back on is how relevant Cummings' testimony was, because I do think the only thing he said is something we already knew, and the only thing he said is also something that's not that problematic. What's problematic is what she did with the messages, not that he was messaging her in the first place. I want to bring up one more clip, because whilst I'm saying I don't think necessarily Laura Kunsberg should be particularly worried about that testimony, even though she should be worried about her reporting that she's done for the past 10 years. I don't think that testimony changes much. If you were watching the BBC News Channel or BBC Two, you might have been slightly suspicious that some kind of conspiracy was taking place. Let's take a look.
I was working, say, roughly 100-hour weeks. Of that time, less than an hour a week for sure, less than 1%, much less than 1% was spent talking to the media. I did occasionally talk to people. The main person...
We're going to say goodbye now to viewers on BBC Two, continuing with our coverage of Dominic Cummings' evidence here on the BBC News Channel.
Give guidance to her on certain very big stories. For example, I'll give you an example of the sort of thing I did.
So that was... Okay, the first clip we showed you was also from the BBC. It's from BBC Parliament, so it's not, they're not trying to erase that testimony from history. But the idea that the moment he talks about Laura Kunsberg, it just so happens that on BBC Two and the BBC News Channel, where most people are watching this, they talk over at exactly that moment. I imagine it's probably a coincidence. Maybe someone in the editorial room sort of panicked and said, talk over this now, knowing that they wouldn't be able to erase it from history. I got no idea what went on there. Aaron, what's your assessment of that very interestingly placed voiceover when Cummings started talking about Laura Kunsberg?
I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it like you say, I think it was a reflex response, and it speaks to the culture of the BBC, which is we're never wrong. Any exposure to us which is necessary, immediately either get rid of it or deny it. That there is a complete lack of accountability with the BBC, and even with the Bashir stuff. By the way, the Bashir stuff is just crazy. The world could end in 7 days, and it would be reported less than Martin Bashir was a fortnight ago. With regards to the Princess Diana interviews, I found the whole thing unbelievable in terms of how it was reported, particularly by BBC. You listen to the Today programme in the morning, you listen to World at One, the PM programme, the World Tonight, whatever. There's sort of 4 flagships of the 6 o'clock news. Everything was the first story. The BBC, Martin Bashir, the government, and the next day the government's responded. So and so's responded to the government. The government's now doing this. Bashir non-stop for a week. Look, I mean, and the former Director General of the BBC, it only went, a year ago, 18 months ago? The whole thing's very strange. But I do believe the BBC has a serious, profound cultural problem. It can't take criticism. It can't do criticism. It was set up in an era where it is, yes, it's a state broadcaster. I believe it's also a regime broadcaster in times of crisis, like a war, like a general strike, which we know from documentary evidence, it was very much a regime broadcaster. I think it's very bad at dealing with internal dissent, and it's very bad at dealing with external criticism of its work. And that's because it literally comes from a different era. And I like the BBC. I really believe in public service broadcast, but it has a problem with regards to its cultural attitudes on these things. It's very, very bad. It's self-obsessive. So either it sort of fixates on internal criticism to the detriment of reporting on anything else, or it ignores it altogether. Surely there's a kind of middle ground here. We saw it again in the last election, 2019. There were multiple instances, Michael, of the BBC doing very strange stuff. Laura Kunsberg talking the day before the general election about electoral ballot returns, or the editing of a response to Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn during a hustings to make it look more favourable to Boris Johnson, or the fact that an activist was wrongfully presented as having assaulted a Conservative advisor. One or two of these, okay, but it happened time after time after time. After a while, Michael, you aren't a conspiracist to see a pattern. A pattern is a pattern. Do I think that's an organised conspiracy? No. But I think it speaks to the politics and the culture of the BBC, which is very bad for both public service journalism, but also actually, incidentally, any progressive political project in this country. Because it will always align itself with small c Conservative interests, the status quo and the powerful. Not good enough, because that's not what we pay for.
A very persuasive summary of that story. Let's move on to our last story, which is about the Batley and Spen by-election. Could it be the one that brings down Keir Starmer? A date has been set for the by-election that could decide Keir Starmer's future. Batley and Spen will go to the polls on the 1st of July. There is a by-election there because the incumbent MP for the constituency, Tracy Brabin, is moving on to become the West Yorkshire mayor. Now, this contest currently has a Labour MP, could be a big challenge for the party. They only won by a narrow margin in 2019. We can get up those results. So in 2019, Tracy Brabin won, but with only 42.7% of the vote. You can see the Conservatives were on 36%. So there's only a sort of 3,500 majority for the Labour Party. Slightly different dynamic to in Hartlepool, because the Brexit Party didn't get much in this constituency. They only got 3.2%. But you have a wild card, which is the Heavy Woolen District Independents, whose candidate was Paul Halloran. They got 12.2%. So it'll be interesting where those votes go. Now, the Heavy Woolen District Independents, they do have some crossover with UKIP, some of the same personnel. So it's quite possible they have a similar voter base, but it'll be interesting to see where they go. It's not as obvious as when it comes to the Brexit Party. The obvious comparison here, as I've already intimated, is Hartlepool. That was the by-election that Labour lost to catastrophically really earlier this month. Now, it's similar in the sense that it's a traditionally Labour voting place, and it did vote for Brexit. At the same time, it didn't vote for Brexit to quite the same degree that Hartlepool did. So in Hartlepool, there was 70% leave. In Batley and Spen, and we think about 60% leave. I say we think because the boundaries of the EU referendum weren't on this constituency, but that seems to be the best estimate, that it was about 60%. So Brexit, but not as Brexit. Another difference with Hartlepool is that it also has a much larger ethnic minority population. That should be more favourable to Labour. It also includes a large Muslim community. Now, that is why one particular candidate seems to think he can go into the constituency and cause an upset. That's George Galloway. He will be standing, I think, as an independent, and this is a video of his launch.
The political class here has taken the voters that I see around me entirely for granted. They assume that you're a vote bank, that you'll vote for them whatever they do, or more often, whatever they do not do. They know the things that matter to you, but they don't care. For example, during Gaza, you were crying. They were supporting Israel in the bombardment. The leader of the Labour Party, against whom I'm standing here, doesn't matter who else is on the ballot paper, I'm standing against Keir Starmer. Why? Because Keir Starmer has made it clear, let's be fair, he's been honest. He said, I am a Zionist without equivocation. The meaning of equivocation is unconditional. He unconditionally supports Israel. Well, I unconditionally support the Palestinians. And I have been doing so for 50 years. Not yesterday or last week, but for 50 years. I unconditionally, without equivocation, support the right of the Palestinian people to be free. And I think there are thousands of people in Batley and Spen who agree with me on that.
So you can see there George Galloway trying to make Palestine a big issue in this election. Labour have been fairly weak on it. He's saying, I unconditionally stand with the Palestinians, what presumably lots of people in the constituency will like to hear. Aaron, he has caused massive upsets before. He has beaten Labour in constituencies with large Muslim populations. This time around, I think it's unlikely he'd win, but the way he's sort of pitching himself against Keir Starmer, I think he's trying to help Labour lose, essentially. Do you think he could manage that? Yeah,
so let's look at this kind of as a sequence of what he's got going for him and against him. Firstly, it's only a month long, which is a problem for him. He can't win in a month. No, he can't. Secondly, you've got COVID. So the extent that he can have rallies, hustings, if there are hustings indoors, multiple hustings, he's going to clearly cause major problems for Labour. If we were having this like with Hartlepool, less so, right? Because people are going to hear less from him. So I think there's a lot of kind of moving parts here. I think in 2017, he only got 2,500 votes in Manchester Gorton in a by-election. But 2,500 votes here, which I think would be the baseline, that's the bottom, I think, here, would be enough probably to really screw Labour. 3,500 majority. You've got, like you say, these independents who are kind of quite far to the right. You've got the Brexit issue and so on. I think if he gets 2,500, then Labour lose this. And like you say, Michael, people say, well, he got 20,000 votes in Scotland or whatever. George Galloway's forte is foreign policy in the Middle East. He won 2005 Bourne-Bethnal Green as a respect candidate, Michael. He beat Labour in Bourne-Bethnal Green as a respect candidate. During that campaign, Michael, he went to Bangladesh, right? He didn't just campaign in Tower Hamlets. He literally went to Bangladesh campaigning, right? It's just unbelievable. And then in Bradford West, I believe, what year was that? It wasn't 2014, was it 20? Anyway, Bradford West before 2015 when he lost to Naz Shah. By the way, when he lost to Naz Shah, he still got 8,500 votes. He's beaten Labour twice, running as a respect candidate, running as somebody who's very principled on foreign policy. And to be fair to him, the only thing he's ever been consistent on is foreign policy stuff. He said horrific things about, for instance, Naz Shah. He said some really, really bad things about many people he's run against. His views on the union, his kind of tilt to the right on cultural issues recently is kind of odd. He's a political narcissist, but he's very good at this, Michael. And I think if the cards roll his way, I think he'll do better than 2,500 votes, and that means he's going to win. I put some photos in the script, and what we just saw there was George Galloway at his launch. And actually, there was a photo going around of Kim Ledbetter, who's the Labour candidate. She actually went to the same place. But the people, they were wearing the Palestine T-shirts. The difference is those people wearing the Palestine T-shirts had sort of vote George Galloway when he was there. So we can already see he's getting endorsements from people that Kim Ledbetter's not getting. A shorter campaign also doesn't suit Labour necessarily because they're meant to have this ground campaign, although clearly under Keir Starmer that's gone. So I think the shorter campaign, the presence of George Galloway, I think the weakness nationally of Keir Starmer, I think Labour loses by a couple of thousand. That may change, right? That may change. Kim Ledbetter as a candidate was a Hail Mary of a candidate. They rarely work. They very rarely work. And actually, I think that demonstrates Labour's desperation here, but they can work. So we'll see. But I think she has big problems and I think she'll lose. And the question is, if she does lose, what happens to Keir Starmer?
I mean, it probably is worth emphasising for the record that while, on the face of it, George Galloway standing against Keir Starmer for being unprincipled on the Israel-Palestine conflict, that might seem fair enough on some level. He's also has a history of being a very unpleasant person very recently. I mean, especially very recently when he was running against Naz Shah. Part of her backstory is that she was in a forced marriage and suffered abuse within that marriage. He said she was basically lying about all of that, giving quotes to newspapers saying the ex-abusive husband has denied being abusive. You know, real nasty campaigning. So I'm 100% not backing Galloway in this constituency, but at the same time, he is exploiting weaknesses that I think, you know, Keir Starmer has brought upon himself to some degree. Also in the constituency, someone who I think will be much less of a threat to anyone is Lawrence Fox. It's unlikely he'll be standing, but he is pictured here with Paul Halloran. So he is the candidate who I explained to you earlier came third last time around with the heavy Woolen District Independents. He got 6,400 votes. I presume probably Lawrence Fox wants him to stand for his what's his party, the Reclaim Party. But I would have thought that Paul Halloran will say that actually I can do much better as a local independent than with your party that has, you know, no supporters. So I think George Galloway is probably going to be able to amass more of a following than Lawrence Fox in that constituency. Aaron, quick fire round. Will Labour win or lose this constituency? And will Keir Starmer go?
We'll see. I think they'll lose it. The question is how badly. If they lose it like Hartlepool, 7,000-8,000 votes, which I can't foresee. If they lose that, he has to go, and he will go. And from what I'm told by sources is in the last couple of weeks, really, in the last week, the Labour right's losing confidence with Keir Starmer too. That includes bureaucrats, that includes people on the NEC, that includes MPs. They're not defending him anymore. And I think they don't want to be associated with somebody who goes down really badly. And it looks like they may go down really badly in Batley and Spen.
C with £10 moved to Batley over the last weekend. So excited to take part in watching Keir lose another Labour seat, but in person. Very exciting stuff. It's a very entertaining comment. Well, do keep in touch. Let us know what's going on the ground in Batley. I think Aaron's planning to go up soon. For now, Aaron, it's been a pleasure as always spending my Friday evening with you.
It's been my pleasure, Michael. Thank you for having me. And Batley and Spen is going to be an amazing story for us to cover, and I can't wait to go up there.
And thank you for watching. If you haven't already, do hit the subscribe button. For now, we'll be back on Monday. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.